Hi, you guys. This is Richard Sachs. I'm your host on Lost Arts Radio. It's nice to be with you again. We've got a show that I'm excited about tonight because I'm really into education. As you know, I've been thinking about new educational systems since I was in junior high school or before, which is a really long time ago. And our guest, Alex Newman, was kind enough to refer us to the academic director of the academy that he works in for education, which is Freedom Project Academy. We'll talk about that. And that was Dr. Duke Pesta, professor of English at the University of Wisconsin and main person, an academic director and teacher at the Freedom Project Academy, and somebody who's deeply into education himself. He's the author of a book called Renaissance and the Postmodern, which we can talk about what that means, a study of comparative critical values. And he was involved in developing and implementing an elective Bible course that is available now for students, high school students in Texas, which is a really super interesting idea too. We've got enough to talk about for several days here. And he's also an authority on Common Core, something that you guys know a little bit about. We'll get into more if we have time. And the general topic that we've gotten into previously of the federal takeover of education. Also the host of his own show called The Dr. Duke Show. I'm sure that it would be definitely worth listening to and participating in. A lot of his work can be seen at the websites freedomproject.com and fpeusa.org. So that's what we've got to go into in the next few minutes here. And really glad that you're here, Dr. Pesta, and have a lot of interesting stuff to talk about.
Thanks for having me.
Sure. Okay, starting right off, since our time is going to go quickly, the question came up when I first talked to Alex about it, and actually it was Doug, whose son was the focus of it at the time. We know about Freedom Project Academy and options for kids when they're in K through 12. So what happens to them after that if they have this idea that they want to go to college or spend their time the best they can for education? What do you think are their real options in the environment as it is today?
Well, I do think college is really oversold. About 4 out of 10 of my university students, and I teach at the University of Wisconsin system, which is considered to be a very good university system. About 4 out of 10, 40% of my kids probably don't belong in college. Either they are intellectually unable to do the work or they attitudinally won't do it. And so first thing I would say to any mom who's sending her kid to college is, does your kid need college, number one, and does he or she need it right away? I think there's no 17-year-old in this country who should go to college. I think when they graduate from high school, they're not ready intellectually or emotionally. I think what I would urge parents to do is, if you have to send your kid to education, do the 2-year tech college route. They can live at home. It's a lot cheaper. They can work and save some money. The ones who work hard and save some money, they may realize they don't need the 4-year degree. Or if they, after 2 years, decide that they have to have it, then they can go. They'll be a little bit older. They'll be a little bit wiser. They'll have worked in the public sector for a while, so they'll be less susceptible to the kind of mindless socialist educational philosophies they're likely to find in college anyway.
Right. So, I mean, you haven't mentioned any strong reasons why somebody would actually want to go to college at this point. Are there some?
Well, unfortunately, the universities do a lot of accrediting, don't they? I mean, if you want to be a teacher, you almost can't teach anyway, which is ridiculous. I mean, we don't need 4 years in an education college to be able to, if you're an accountant, to be able to teach math to kids. But if you want to be a lawyer or a doctor, it is really shameless how we've allowed so many of our careers to require an education that has very little to do ultimately with what you end up doing. I mean, so from that perspective, I would say, unless you really, really need the accreditation, don't bother with it. But there are other reasons to go. I mean, if you know what you want to major in, if you know for a fact that you have a plan, the worst thing I guess I could say is, don't send your kids to college to find themselves. Don't send your kids to college, pay $10, $20, $30, $40,000 a year to mess around with 3 or 4 different majors, drop one, pick up another one. That's going to get them in debt real fast, and it's going to burn them out. If you know exactly what it is you want to do, then maybe it's worth doing on a focused track. But other than that, it's not a place to quote unquote find yourself.
Right. Well, I've noticed that, I mean, there's been a lot of degeneration of what's taught in college and universities in the last 50 years for sure, and probably before that. But I'm in the middle of that environment now, in a PhD program. I was in the university originally in the 60s, and then now I'm in another project, and I'm noticing that I haven't really found any teachers there. They're mostly facilitators now that are going down their own checklist of what they have to say. And I was wondering, where does that come from? And I've initially found out that it comes from the accrediting agencies, because they have little contracts that you have to sign if you want to be accredited, and it tells you what to teach and how, right? And so individuality is really frowned on. At least it's
that is part of it. I think the accrediting does have a say, but you can't discount the fact that what gets taught in college is what professors want to teach. Our professors are more and more left-wing. They see education, and it's not just college. You were in the 60s a college student. You think about this. Going back to the elementary, middle, and high school, that college mentality that says the primary purpose of education is social change, is social justice, is conditioning children, conditioning young adults to be the kind of kids that progressives want. That university idea is now, through things like Common Core, it's now the main ethos of high school, middle, and elementary school teaching as well. 25 years ago when I started teaching college, the kids that came to class, 25 years was in Indiana, Purdue University. Okay. A lot of rural kids, a lot of first-generation kids. They didn't know much of anything. They were pretty ignorant at the college level, but they were humble. They knew they didn't know things. They wanted knowledge. They were willing to swallow their pride and let a teacher teach them something. Fast forward 25 years. The kids I'm getting to college now at university, they're every bit as ignorant as those kids were 25 years ago. In some ways, they're more ignorant. They're much more ignorant of American history now than they were 25 years ago. But they are much more politically entitled. They think that not knowing things is a boon. Not knowing the evil racist history of America makes you a socially just person. Not understanding how economics works, right? So that you get the idea that you become socialist minded. Not understanding how real markets work or how economics works. That's considered a source of pride now. So in 25 years, they went from ignorant to teachable, to ignorant and unteachable. We have a crisis on this country of 19-year-old college kids demanding administrators change policy and throw out Western culture and provide safe spaces. And the faculty and the university administrators are all too happy to do it. They're afraid of the students. In a way, I guess I could sum it up this way. Now it's the students who are teaching the faculty. College is not a place where faculty teach willing students. It's a place where politically woke students are demanding irrational changes, and faculty and administrators are caving in.
Right. And I totally agree that they have ignorance in all these areas like basic history and things like that, economics especially, and important issues like that. But I can't imagine them saying, well, the reason I don't know about that stuff is because I think it's good to be unaware of it. Somehow they think they're aware of the things that matter that supersede that, right?
Well, what they're told by their teachers is that they shouldn't pay too much attention. Don't read Shakespeare too carefully. Don't pay much attention to American history. He's just a dead white male. That's just about racism and tyranny. Listen to us instead. We'll give you the Cliff Notes version. And the Cliff Notes version of American history is America is racist, sexist, bigoted, homophobic, and transphobic. The founding fathers were racist slave owners. America is an imperialist country. Literally in about 45 minutes, that same narrative gets repeated again and again and again, from their earliest experiences with history in elementary school all the way through college, and they never learn an alternative way of seeing it. And so by the time they're college, this really does, if you understand this, and I know you do, this really explains what's going on in college campuses. I've talked to a lot of moms and dads who say, what in the world's going on? How is it possible that these kids 19 and 20 years old, that 54% of millennials prefer socialism to capitalism? Antifa is made up almost exclusively of disaffected college kids. How could it be that these kids, by the time they get to college, are ready to throw everything away, to demand changes based on nothing in reality, and join violent groups like Antifa? Well, the answer is they get their education now at the earliest stages to prepare them for this. They are bred to hate their country, to hate free markets, to hate liberty, to hate the Second Amendment, to see free speech as a problem. They're taught that now when they're 6 and 7 years old, and it's all they get through high school.
Yeah, exactly. So what is it? I guess there's two questions that come from that, from the kids' point of view and from the people who are implementing that agenda. From the kids' point of view, why do they seem to fall for it so readily now?
Because as we know, the younger you are, so this accounts for the 60s, it accounts for the roaring 20s, it accounts for so many things historically. We know that young people from early teens on tend to be very passionate and idealistic. They are full of energy and they want an outlet for that energy. Again, you think about the major revolutions in tearing down culture, it's usually young people who are at the forefront of those, right? They were the young people who stormed the Bastille in the 18th century. And so the progressive elite have realized that if you can weaponize young people, keep them ignorant, don't let them think critically, don't let them understand both sides of our history, just keep them angry, then what you're going to get is what you're seeing on campus now. To the faculty, they have weaponized these students to do what they never could do through the voting box, which is demand change, to engage in kind of violent, revolutionary, anarchist behavior. What they want to see, what the faculty has wanted to see, at least since the 1960s, is traditional American culture pulled down in favor of some kind of a socialist utopia. And they couldn't get it. When college actually educated kids, most kids recognized when they got both sides of the story that for all America's warts, we still have achieved a remarkable amount. For that slavery is a global problem. It wasn't just an American problem. And yet freedom and liberty are very rare, but we don't give them those narratives anymore. And it's ironic, isn't it, that this most privileged of generations, with all this technology in the palm of their hand and their devices, with all this access to world media, with all this internet and web connectivity, is in many ways the most ignorant generation we've created since the founding of the country. And that's by design.
So they've been given a ready-made cause, I guess, right? And you were saying that enthusiasm, that desire to go out and fight for something and all that is natural, that is what has been capitalized on, basically. And say, here's a cause that's super emotional. You can fight for this.
And you don't have to think about it. You don't have to read any. We're showing an inconvenient truth in kindergarten classrooms, right? We're conditioning children at young. What we're doing is we're scaring them to death and telling them, unless you do what we tell you, and that means defy your parents, reject biology, reject gender, reject knowledge, reject the scientific method. These are all just holdovers of white supremacy. We're telling them, we're sexualizing these kids. We're giving these kids high-level sexual information and urging them to experiment by the time they're in late elementary school. And so
that the racist bad people were holding that away from them before. Now we're freeing them, right?
Yeah. If you're 7 years old, 9 years old, 11 years old, and sexually active, right? That's very empowering. My mom wouldn't let me do this. My dad wouldn't let me do this. But the school's waking me up. My mom and dad drive cars. My mom and dad have air conditioning in the house. I just learned in my 5th grade classroom that that's destroying the planet. And all of this is being done. All of this is being done to drive a wedge between parents and kids. The schools want to be the parents of this. The schools, run by progressives, they are appropriating to themselves parental responsibilities. We don't care what you think, mom and dad. We're going to teach your kids about sex when we want to. We're going to teach your kids about transgenderism when we want to. We're going to turn your kids against you and your worldview and your religion and your patriotism. We're going to turn you against them. And as every fascist dictator of the last 100 years have said, Hitler made the observation, right? You can fight us all you want, right? Just give us the elementary schools. Vladimir Lenin, you can keep your White Houses, your houses of parliaments. Give us the elementary schools, and we will, in one generation, overcome you.
Well, especially if you have one other element, which is the money. Because if you can keep the parents so busy trying to survive financially or having to follow the orders of the welfare system, that takes them out of the way, right? Well,
it's not. I don't believe it's a coincidence that we have a necessary two-family employment economy, right? It's not an accident that mom or dad can't stay home with the kids. One of the things, the same thing happened. You mentioned the welfare state. Same thing happened, as you know, with the welfare state in the 60s. The African American family in the 40s and 50s. The African African-American family was the most stable family structure in the country. They stayed together longer. They divorced much less. Dads and moms, these were very intricate, tightly knit families that dad worked and mom took care of the kids. Along comes civil rights in the 1960s, and you see what that kind of regulated big state government interference does. The broken African-American home is a consequence of U.S. federal government interventionism.
So now we've learned that the idea of the mother having to take care of children is really sexist and evil.
It's sexist. Well, babies themselves are evil now, right? Babies are when you've got Alyssa Milano, that staggering poster child for lots of politics and little education, out there saying that best thing I ever did was abort my 2 babies in the early 1990s. I wouldn't have had the happy life I had now if I hadn't done that. That attitude, which we see is increasingly pervasive on the left.
It is. It's all over the media as well. I mean, Netflix ran a special celebrating abortion recently with music and dancing and all kinds of stuff.
There was out in California, there was a great man on the street interview that just happened. One of those, it was Cabot or somebody, put the microphone under these kids. They brought a petition for college kids to sign laws protecting unhatched baby eagles, right? And all these college kids were rushing to sign this.
I bet they would support that, yeah.
And then you flip the page, and the same guy asking the petition is, we've also got here a petition to save unborn babies. And to watch these college kids recoil in horror at the possibility that there would be a link that somehow unborn eagles, they couldn't see it. One young girl said, "Eagles are people too," she said. And then she turned around when she saw the abortion petition and she said, "Babies are icky." Yeah. Eagles are people too. And babies, unborn babies, are icky in her advanced college level vocabulary.
So the eagles are actually more human than people.
And so are rivers, and so is the planet, right? And transgenders and gay people are more authentic than heterosexuals. That's minorities are more validly human than Caucasians. What we're doing here is, and you've got the note of this, we're not leveling playing fields. We're not concerned about equality. What we are doing is asserting bigotry, segregation, racism, divisiveness. We are reinserting that on politically correct lines.
It's really sophisticated because we're doing that in the name of fighting those things.
We are segregating colleges, but only for blacks and minorities. So in other words, white people, there's no graduation for white people. To say we're going to have a Caucasian graduation ceremony immediately brands you as a white supremacist and a Nazi. However, African Americans get their own graduation ceremonies. Native Americans get gay and lesbians now. We're building dorms on college campuses just for transgender and gay people, right? We're building dorms on college campuses where only African Americans will live. So in other words, segregation, all that stuff that was the hallmark of traditional racism, the left isn't getting rid of it. They're just turning the tables. You did this to us for a long time. Now we're going to do it to you. And like you said, we're doing it not under the guise that we're being bigoted, but to fight. We're going to fight bigotry by being bigger bigots than you ever were.
Exactly. That gets rid of racism, finally. It's kind of a mind-boggling situation. I mean, it's so sophisticated in how it's put together.
But it's also utterly anti-intellectual, which goes back to the previous point. If we were teaching kids, if the purpose of education was to give kids the ability to choose things, right? Not to choose for them, but to give them the ability to critically think and to weigh and to measure one aspect of a culture versus another, this would never happen. Yeah. And the progressive left figured this out as early as the 1960s, and they took a playbook from the Nazis and the Hitler Youth, took a playbook from the Soviets and the way they divorced parents from children and gave them a state education, and they just figured this out. You know, Bill Ayers, the unrepentant terrorist bomber of the Weather Underground, when he didn't go to jail for his palpable crimes, what did he end up doing? For 30 years, he was a professor of elementary education at the University of Illinois, Chicago, where his main premise was that the place for communism in America today is the elementary school. Right.
And I don't think the rank and file people that follow that kind of stuff really understand much of it. They just kind of absorb it and memorize it. But there's a smaller group that actually engineers this kind of thing, and what their motive is a whole different issue. But one thing you said that I just wanted to comment briefly on is that the idea of getting the kids so that you can take over the rest of society. You can see that actively being used for weaponizing the kids against common sense now, that the kids are being used, for example, there's a group called Organic Consumers Association that I've really supported a lot of what they've done because I've been involved in organic agriculture since the mid-'60s, before the U.S. government was. And I'm a really strong environmentalist in the sense that you don't destroy your life support system if you're intelligent. That's not a really brilliant thing to do. But because they identify as the left side of the political spectrum, they have to be completely in favor of the Green New Deal. And I said, well, there's an economic problem with it, and there's some other problems, and it's not really, it's going to put healthcare in the hands of tyrants in the government who are going to require every drug and vaccine that you could possibly have. You won't have a brain left. These are issues, and they cut off communication. So it's like people have bought so many preconceptions, one of which is that you have to identify with a spot on the political spectrum. You have to have a party, you have to have a label, and then you can't think anything outside whatever that is. And that's against what you said with critical thinking. So they're bringing the kids out there to say, it used to be 12 years, now it's 11 years that the world is going to be destroyed if they don't pass the Green New Deal and pay the tax and borrow so many $1 trillion extra. And the kids are a really effective way to say that, and they believe what they're saying.
Yeah, the kids have no way of fighting this. They don't have any access to any of the parents are so busy working 2 jobs or taking the kids to piano lessons or to soccer games. They don't have time to sit their kids down and say, hey, or even ask them, tell me what you learned in history today, so you could actually give them the other side of the coin. No, we don't do that. And I think you got it right, that what you mentioned there is exactly it, that this is collectivism. What we are teaching kids is to conform to a radical political agenda. And whenever facts or even science get in the way of that agenda, you have to reject facts, economics, or science.
Well, you just memorize
to be pure to the party.
Hate speech, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, it's extreme.
Yeah, you brought up the environment. I think it's a great way of looking at it. Look, there's nothing wrong with conserving. There's nothing wrong with, the root of conservatism is to conserve, right? To protect what we have. Yeah. But now you're taught, like you said, science itself when it comes to gender, right? Yeah. If you on a college campus today, if I as a professor say, you know what, biology teaches us in an undeniable way that there are 2 genders, male and female. To say that now is hate speech on a college campus.
It is.
Literally that science itself has to be rejected in favor of the political fantasies of the left.
Well, science has been redefined as well. I mean, it used to be questioning everything and then observing patterns and setting up hypotheses and experiments and all this stuff. Now it's just memorizing acceptable information and points of view. Right.
And we have a lot of evidence. When the Soviet Union fell in the 1980s, everybody thought the world had been freed of communism. No. What was the very first aspect of Western culture that the communists gravitated to? It was the globalist environmentalist movement, right? The green movement was completely hijacked by people whose only interest was collectivism and globalism and give a rat's rip. Look, this Paris Accord garbage. If the progressive left really cared about the environment, they would be screaming and protesting China for being the world's greatest polluter. But you never hear a word out of the mouths of the left about China. It's only first world Western cultures that have to pay a price. So you're going to get just as much. You go ahead and turn America into a first world country. You're not necessarily a third world country. You're not necessarily going to fix the ozone layer problem, right? You're not going to necessarily fix the so-called carbon problem. All you're going to do is transfer power away from Western culture and conveniently towards countries like China, who have a long history of collectivist and globalist intentions.
Yeah, well, I mean, you're starting to put a picture together that is really different than what we're told on television. And one of the aspects that goes with what you just said is that I know of people that have technologies that are real environmental technologies. They'll override atmospheric pollution. They'll clean up oil spills, as Kevin Costner brought to the Gulf of Mexico, and a lot of other things. They will provide free and clean energy sources that were actually perfected about 100 years ago. Those people are in danger of being murdered by government agents working with industry. And the policy is nothing environmentally beneficial is actually allowed.
I think you could see a lot of evidence for that in the fact that when we try to combat, even the 20 Democrat primary candidates, right? Slavery, environmentalism, pollution, all these things are just a Western problem. When in reality, if you really care about the environment, you're going to have to look almost exclusively outside of Western culture to find where the real problems are. But our cheap political multiculturalism won't let us do it. And I have no doubt, I've never doubted this, right? That anybody who has a real solution to these problems does become an enemy to the progressives, right? Fixing the problem means they no longer have their leverage. The progressive left doesn't want it fixed. The more broken they can convince you it is, the more they'll get you to concede your security, your freedom, and your liberty for their security. You give us the power. What are they all saying? What's Warren and Sanders saying and Kamala Harris? We're going to $100 trillion in new taxes to pay for everything from, nobody will have to pay a penny for school from kindergarten to college. We're going to pay for all your health care. We're going to completely take $40 trillion and clean up the global planet. Give us all your wealth. We'll fix it for you. And it's a lie. It's always been a lie.
Yeah, well, they say it worked in World War II. It made the world wonderful after that. You know, they don't know about what happened to the economic structure and the taxes and all that.
No. And, you know, what's so frustrating about this, and you understand this, I know, what's so frustrating about this is that this is not a new template. This is how tyranny has always worked. This is in the last 250 years. This is how the progressives have always done it. You posit this utopian fantasy that is just outrageously impossible. You dumb down people's ability to see through it. And then all of a sudden, you've got this huge mass of critically uneducated people who think everything will be it's religious in a way, isn't it? The idea of God has been transferred away from some neutral third transcendent party to some political party or some great leader who's going to move us to this promised land.
Well, when you redefine science, it becomes instead of questioning everything, it becomes religious in the sense that if you don't agree with it, you're bad. You can't
science, global warming science today isn't science, it's dogma. It's dogma. You think about what dogma is. Dogma is the tenets of the faith that are unarguable, right? So scientists now have become, I tell my university students this all the time. How many of you have heard the phrase, 98% of scientists all agree on this? And they all raise their hands. And then I ask them a simple question. All right, what percentage of scientists are actually climate scientists? And they're stunned. You know, it's like well less than 1%, right? So I said, all right, so when they tell you that 98% of scientists agree with something, what does that have to do with anything? What does the average pharmacist know about meteorology? What does the average coroner in a laboratory? What does the average chemist working in a lab? They don't know anything more about the environment than you do. But they'll tell you that 98% of scientists, what they should say is 98% of climate scientists think this is true. And that lets you see what a really tiny number that is. And then you ask the question, well, if there's only a handful of real climate scientists in the world, and still 2% of them don't agree with you, right? I mean, but they never, there's no critical thinking. Well, 98%, it's a set of, 98% of scientists believe this, so let's stop arguing and let's give all our money to Bernie Sanders.
I think it's another variety of fake polls. You know, what they call a push poll to try to make it self-fulfilling prophecy type thing.
Well, it's amazing how the media and public relations organizations, think about how successful the left is now of getting all the major corporations to believe what they believe. You've got Walmart now banning gun sales, right? You've got major companies now that are employing transgender commercials added in their commercials. It's amazing how, not even the press, but how corporate America, remember 20 years ago? When we kept hearing from the progressives how all the big corporations were ruining the country, all the big money corporations, they're all right-wing entities. Well, look at today. All of Silicon Valley is left-wing. Look at Target, look at Starbucks, look at the major players in our corporate culture. They have all gone rogue woke. And so this idea that they've got the media, they've got Hollywood, they've got the schools, and now they've got corporations.
Right. And I don't think most of them know the definition of what fascism is, the partnership between corporations and government. And that's really become pretty complete now. In fact, I think most of the government agencies are actually registered as for-profit corporations.
Right.
Right.
That's right. And that's beautifully said. Fascism, by definition, is when governments, totalitarian-minded governments, allow private business ownership only to the degree that those businesses subordinate their collective will to the government's in terms of providing a united front. That's exactly right.
And the collusion is so much more complete than what we've been allowed to see. I think when and I'm watching our time here because I know it's going fast, but when the phrase conspiracy theorist was started after the Kennedy assassination to make sure nobody thought it was more than one person that killed him. And then they found out, wow, this is useful for everything. And using it now on anybody that doesn't have acceptable points of view. The reason that's so central is that the real conspiracy, which Kennedy and Eisenhower and others warned against, is so much more pervasive and broad than most people could imagine. And you see that when somebody comes out that's considered a threat, and you have Chase Bank jumping in and PayPal cutting off their payment systems, and all of the media across the board using the same words to vilify them. And it's a very widespread conspiracy. I think it goes up to levels that may use some political parties like you're talking about, but it's actually coming from a higher level that seems. I
agree. I think the purpose of all, if you ask me in one word, if you say, okay, we're talking about a lot of scary things, we've covered everything from education to banks to finances to companies. You ask me one word, I would give me one word to talk about what's happening here. I would argue that word is globalism. Yeah. And that the people who want one world government, who want to break, the same people who want one world government are the same people in America who are wanting open borders. And that includes the rhino right and not just the progressive left. The Koch brothers, right? These apparently evil Koch brothers, right wingers, they're open borders guys. I mean, the establishment Republicans are no better than the establishment Democrats when it comes to some of these globalist initiatives. And you're right, somebody higher up is pulling the strings on that.
Right. And when you look, just deductively at what they're doing, it's not just for population reduction and to move all the wealth to a few hands, because they're destroying the life support system of the whole planet in ways that are irrevocable by known technology. And they would not do that if they were saving it for themselves.
You're exactly right. And to be a globalist today means you are anti-human. To be a globalist, it means the unborn, the very old, the push towards suicide on demand, reimagining suicide as a brave choice in the face of overpopulation. It's very anti-human. Agenda 2130 at the UN, which wants to push people off the land and jam everyone into these big cities. No one will be allowed into the wilderness areas. You certainly can't use them for their resources. Places like Idaho, right? I have friends in Idaho who they're not allowed in Idaho to clear the undergrowth out of their forests. So every year the forests burn. And then when the forests burn, the government comes in and says, okay, now no one can live here. So the government wants, they want to burn people off the land. They won't let native Idahoans keep the forests free of fire tinder. Right. They want them to burn because when 40, 50 million acres burn, then they can turn around and say, we confiscate this in the name of disaster and no one will ever live here.
And a lot of it, they say they already own anyway, even though it's unconstitutional. I mean, I'm in Arizona and the government supposedly owns like 80% of the state. Right. It's pretty amazing. And as far as the fires go, I agree that it's mismanagement, but it's also not helped by dumping explosive metal dust on the forest for decades.
Sure.
And then triggering it. I mean, that's going on in front of everybody's face and almost no one says anything about it or notices is a real tribute to education, I think.
Yeah, it's a notorious tribute in the sense that we have so taught little kids to believe narratives, and as they get to become bigger kids and then college kids, and how my university kids respond to facts that contradict their worldview is not reflection, is not second thinking, it's not more study, it's anger. When they hear things that do not match up with the progressive lies they've been told all their lives, it doesn't necessarily change them. It makes them angry. We've triggered them that when anybody, even with facts, challenges their worldview, it's why you get the Antifa types, right?
Yeah, those are called hate facts when they gender, right? A new term. And I think you brought up something really important, is that the indoctrination has not just been ideas. It's ideas coupled with intense emotional states. And that's really what gives them power.
By definition, these aren't they're ideologies, not ideas. We teach kids ideologies, not ideas. Ideas are things that have been run through the mill of evidence, of experience, of common sense. An idea is something that has to be measured and tested. For any kid, right? You touch that red burner on the stove, you're going to get burnt, right? Yeah. That's an idea. And a horrible but practical reality is when you verify the idea, you never do it again. Right. Instead of teaching ideas, we're teaching ideologies, which are exactly what you said, purely political and purely emotional. Right. And so an ideology is to take an emotional feeling and to tie it to somebody's preferred political understanding, and harnessing the anger or the despair or the high level of hormonal stimulation that makes teenagers so bubbly. Harnessing that to an ideology, not to a discernible idea.
Yeah. And the thing about the identification with right and left, and what you mentioned about how both so-called sides of the political spectrum, or both parties, are working for the destruction of this country and most of the world right now in a very harmonious way, just fighting on the surface. You see that even when somebody turns up who has good intent, because their education has been skewed as well, and they've memorized a bunch of stuff that they think they've learned, but they just memorized it. And the current U.S. president is an example of that, I think, because his motivation is actually good, and that's rare, and that's why they want him dead. But he's got huge gaps in understanding and believes in great companies, regardless of what they're actually doing to people. And 5G and 6G and total surveillance, and right now he's listening to proposals for these devices in your house reporting back on you about which rights should be taken away.
I agree. I think that Donald Trump, what's so amazing about Donald Trump is, in spite of all of this indoctrination, a huge number of Americans wanted somebody in office who was not an inside political player. And that tells me there's hope, right? In spite of all of the one-sided narratives, in spite of the corruption of the media, the corruption of our entertainment industry, our big companies working against our best interests, still huge numbers of Americans wanted to elect an outsider, and they did. The problem is exactly what you say, though, is that Donald Trump's he was a Democrat in New York for the first 40 years of his life. Yeah. He is not in any way, shape, or form. He's a political outsider, but his own education, like you said, has bought into many of the lies of the left. And so, you're right. He's not suspicious enough about companies and corporations. Why is it so hard for him to simply say, yes, you know what? We're going to designate Antifa a terrorist group? Why not? They're behaving that way, and yet he keeps talking about it, but he never does it. That kind of stuff just drives you nuts. Or the fact that he appointed as his Secretary of Education somebody who was going to keep the status quo. He promised us when he ran for president he was going to get rid of the Department of Education. Not only has he not ever returned to that conversation, the woman in charge now is a very, very long-standing preserver of a broken status quo.
Yeah, exactly. And I know he wants the idea of freedom and knows that's supposed to go with America, but total surveillance and control of everything you think, say, and do may not be the best way to freedom.
No. And by the way, I get that he wants to close the borders down, but then he wants to have a North American free trade treaty, which undermines American sovereignty to a nameless, faceless bureaucracy. So Mexico, New York, Mexico, the United States, and Canada, he wants part of some Uber league who won't be controlled by Congress. So Congress will no longer have major authoritarian power over the American people. It will be some trade organization above it. It's the same guy who rightly sees that without borders, we can't be a country, is the same guy who's seriously trying to cede our economic sovereignty.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the idea that you can have, I guess the first thing I wanted to say about that is that in that MCA USA agreement, there are clauses that give validity to total censorship by big tech. Yeah. And instead of realizing that they are already like 1,000 times bigger threat to the coming election than any other country, he's looking at giving them the authority to decide whose unalienable rights should be taken away.
Not only that, as is typical of these things, Mexico, being the third world country of the three, has negotiated the ability to keep its own oil rights. Whereas Canada and America forfeit theirs. They will not primarily be the citizens of those countries in charge of their own fossil fuels. Yeah. In Mexico, so Mexico gets to be part of the alliance, but they don't have to play by the same rules.
So a lot of the problem is delegating the authority to work out a great agreement, not having time to read it yourself. And it's much like the people in Congress voting on stuff they never read.
Of course. The healthcare law was voted on, the education law, ESSA, thousands of pages. They vote on it in 2 days. And, you know, the American people have no idea what's going on. I mean, and it's especially difficult with these treaties because they're so arcane and they're so unsexy. Education has a lot more glamour, economic things. But when you're talking about trade treaties, people just fall asleep watching live. And so a lot of the stuff is negotiated and done without anybody knowing about it. And again, go back to that. I mean, as much as it has been refreshing to see an outsider who does share some of the founding virtues of the country, but he doesn't know how to kill it. No, but he also doesn't know how to save it either.
That's right. That's right. I mean, somebody's going to have a lot higher level understanding. And apparently the field of potential candidates for the future that could do that is very restricted because they also have to be an independent billionaire and they can't get in.
Right. And so the whole system's been closed off. In a way, if you look at where politics have gone and how impossible it is, how by definition, the more years you spend in Congress, the richer you get, which is why nobody leaves. This right there is a dangerous warning sign, right? That power goes along with money, and the two of them are related, and the place for that is primarily in the halls of our elected government. That's bad news, no matter who you are.
And it's not just because they're being frugal. You know, like Rousseau's wife in the Pink Panther, it's that they're actually getting inside trade deals. They're getting paid off for all kinds of stuff. And they've got the carrot and the stick between the blackmail and the bribes controlling everything they do. And why would they want to read anything? They just need to do what they're told.
No, and in fact, what they keep doing, Democrats and Republicans both, is voting themselves more power over us, right? And stripping away what legal rights to representation, to association, to speech, to arm ourselves, undermining at every step those values. There's a reason. There's a reason why this is happening more in America than anywhere else. It's because once you effectively have transformed America, as many others have pointed out, there's nowhere else in the world you can look to and say, okay, there's this bastion left. Once it's gone here and it's going, then it's downhill for the globalists.
The question does come up too, if you see that it passes some point of no return, which, you know, I don't know how you define that because there's all kinds of mysterious inputs that could come from places we don't know, but if it passes that point, there's really nowhere I know of to run away to.
And speaking of points of no return, I would humbly suggest to you that what's happening right now on our border is potentially one of those points of no return. You have flooded the country and planed and bussed immigrants who are not even here illegally to particularly red parts of the country. Texas is a classic example. All kinds of news stories now that if Texas does go blue in the next election, it's over. You are never going to have another Republican president. Not that they've done much good, but the fact is that if they are successful in turning Texas blue, which is the only state in terms of electoral power that can vie with California, which is complete. California's pretty much eliminated Republicans from government. Right? They've almost eliminated them. And if Texas goes that way, that's one of those points of no return. And if Texas does go that way, it's going to be because of illegal immigration.
And so, you know, one of the big important issues with that is why are so many people who are helping with that transformation into basically a communist country to fight fascism and all that? Well, I guess we've already answered the question. I was going to say, why is it so hard for those people not to see what they're serving? And I think the thing is that their programming is very effective.
It is. And every American school kid knows how to hate Nazis.
Yeah.
Not one of them knows how to hate socialists. Think about it, right?
They don't even realize that the Nazis were socialists.
They don't know. I have to tell them that the National Socialist German Workers' Party, they think that Nazis are right-wing Christian fascists. They believe that. The Nazis were not right-wing, and they were certainly not believers in God. They were typical socialists in that they were atheist occultists, right? Yeah. And the idea of National Socialism, among the first things that the Nazi Party did was to ban gun ownership, to create national socialized medicine, right? Yeah. I mean, and to ban homeschooling. Right. I mean, so if you look at the paradigms of Nazism, they're lockstep in line with what the Bolsheviks did. Right. The differences are so minute between Nazism, but our kids have been led to believe, that's why the phrase Nazi is so effective on the left. Our kids understand why Nazis were wicked. But the Soviets, who did pretty much everything the Nazis did, only on a grander scale, killed many more people. Yeah. They're considered so over-exuberant socialists, decent people who may have gone a little too far, but that doesn't
exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah, and we'll fix it. We American socialists are going to fix it. Right. What are the Democrats calling themselves? No. We're democratic. That's an oxymoron, like icy hot, right? We're democratic socialists, right? And no one talk about a lack of critical thinking. If somebody comes up to you and said, "Hey, this is icy hot. This is both hot and cold at the same time," you're going to look at them and you're going to roll your eyes. Somebody comes up to a typical American college kid, "Hey, I'm a democratic socialist. I'm a socialist who believes in democracy and freedom." Our college kids are utterly unable to see through that.
Right, no problem with that stuff. So, to me, this is the beginning of a discussion, that would be fun to carry on. And maybe if you're able to come back, what I'd like to get into on the next part of it might be what you found out in your book, because the title of it's really interesting. I'm sorry I haven't read it yet. I just heard about it yesterday. The comparison between the values during the Renaissance time, which I don't think is taught in school anymore anyway, and what's going on right now, and what you can learn from that. I think that would be super interesting.
Yeah, I would love to come back anytime. Yeah, I'm sorry I had to leave a little early today, but
that's okay.
Send me another email. We'll set up a sequel.
That sounds great. So hold on, and we'll say goodbye in the break here. So there goes Duke Pesta, Dr. Duke Pesta, Academic Director of Freedom Project Academy, and somebody I'm really glad that we got on, even though I'm sorry it was such a short show, but we went over a lot in a few minutes. And I think that he would agree. We don't have a problem of, left versus right. We have a problem of freedom versus tyranny. And the generations now are being educated that you go out and destroy society for the sake of freedom, and use fascist techniques for the sake of fighting fascism, and all this stuff that people who are still somewhat conscious should say, wait a minute, what was that middle part that you're saying I should do about beating up people, women and kids with bike locks in order to fight fascism? We need to go over that again. They don't usually say that. They just say, yeah, that sounds really true. And it's basically, it's not a left or right problem. It's a mass insanity problem. And, for example, I don't think of myself in terms of being right wing or left wing or anything. I've got attitudes about the environment being really important that the left-wing people would probably say, well, that means you're on the left side. And I've got attitudes about freedom and getting rid of Agenda 21 that the right-wing people would say, oh, yeah, that's really true. But they need to break down these barriers and labels and say, look, we don't care what's acceptable. We don't care. We recognize we've been programmed to hate against hate, right? That doesn't work either. There's all these contradictions and oxymorons like Dr. Pesta was bringing up, and people don't seem to notice. You look in the sky, and anybody that notices there's white lines behind the jets that shouldn't be there anymore, because if you look into it, the high bypass turbofan engines don't produce white lines or water vapor or anything. They're clean in that sense anyway. They produce hydrocarbons, unburned hydrocarbons and other toxins, but these long white lines that turn the whole sky gray and blot out the sun for hours and hours, if not days, that's not normal. That it's not a left or right issue at all, and both sides of the spectrum in the government never say anything about that stuff. So many other things like that. The left-right thing is just not the point. It's freedom and clarity of mind and ultimately consciousness. And I know that in the beginning of America, which is it's not more important than any other country in the sense that every country has got incredible people in it that deserve all and have all the same rights as anywhere. But in America, they recognize those rights you're born with, and they can't be taken away. And that's one of the reasons that America is really targeted to take down right now. And it would be good if those of us that are being targeted to become the facilitators of that self-destruction would stop and say, let's just stop just for a second, from hating the president or hating all the Republicans or hating the stupid Democrats or hating the atheists or whoever you're going to hate. That's the wrong frequency for healing. It's just completely wrong. There's something deeper that has been intentionally trained out of us that would unite everybody in common interest, because it doesn't matter, what little subdivision of humanity you're in. Almost all of your real interests are common with everybody else. And one of our natural abilities is clear thought and clear perception and observation of what's being done. And it's like that's one of the main things that's being targeted now. That's why I mentioned to Dr. Pesta that it's not just people on a certain political perspective that are the threat. That's being used. The crazy left-wing people and the crazy right-wing people and the crazy independent people and the crazy racist people of every race, and this idea that you can only be racist against people of dark skin is completely stupid. I mean, that anybody would believe that is amazing. That the system wanted us to be against people of dark skin earlier in the 20th century. Now they want you to be against people with light skin, and because it's a different color, you think, well, that couldn't be racist. What? Are we totally brain dead? I mean, yeah, just about. So the thing is, the future of the world is going to depend on whether we can shake that off. At least some small critical minority can get out of the fighting paradigm, and especially hating paradigm. Fighting for self-defense, I understand, but hating and demonizing any big section of humanity is ignoring the fact that if we're going to be okay, they need to be waked up as well as us. And if we focus on that, there's a chance that the rulers at the top level of this whole system won't succeed in planetary suicide, which is exactly where they're going. This is not about just New Age feudalism, where everybody is poor except for the rulers. It's not just about population reduction, although that's a step in the agenda. It's about extermination of the biosphere, and anybody that is somewhat even conscious a little bit can see that they're killing the ecosystem, which is our life support system. You don't have to be a left-wing person to understand that. In fact, most of the left-wing people don't. They've taken it into crazy other areas, but the real environmental concerns are common to everybody. And the way that the rulers are right now implementing policies that exterminate the biosphere in ways that are irrevocable shows clearly that they're not after just eliminating most of us and keeping the world for themselves. That's not what's happening. Even though close friends of mine think that, and I think that is a step, but that's not the goal. And the danger is of them accomplishing their goal, which is not a very good thing to have happen. And it's really in our hands, each one of us, not how many other people you convince, but who you become. Because by who you become, that affects other people. If you just go out and give speeches, even if they're great speeches for good causes, and you've got all this conflict inside yourself, and you're really upset and angry all the time, and you're hating the bad guys and want to destroy them and everything, that's the energy that you leave behind. And I know this sounds probably unrealistic or imaginary to some people, but it's really powerful. And that programming, it gets reversed by the effect of you if you deprogram yourself. So it's a good place to start. I mentioned to Dr. Pesta maybe before we went on the air that we started this separate group because the censorship is getting so horrible that there's a lot of things we can't say anymore. People are going to jail for just saying things that are true because they're labeled as unacceptable by the power structure. They're trying to control speech on the way to controlling thought. And so we started a private group for people that really want to work toward changing the trajectory that society is on. It's called Planetary Healing Club. It would only appeal to those few people that are actually willing to do the work on themselves. Most people aren't really ready for that. If you want to, I would meet you there live every week, interactive, and there's some interesting stuff going on there. Access point is at planetaryhealingclub.com if you want to check that out. And if you have questions about it or anything, feel free to ask me. I'm still accessible by email, richard@lostartsradio.com. If you want to support our work, try to keep us on the air at least for a while and keep this work going. And eventually, if we get the funds together to build a school where some of these really important things can be demonstrated in real life, we have a new Subscribe Star account. It would be really nice if you have the ability. It starts at like, $1 or $5 a month or something. If you've got access to larger amounts of funds, please help us on a bigger scale. It'll make a big difference. And if we could build our school sooner, that would also be a good thing for the world, I think. So that's going on subscribestar.com/LostArtsRadio. Also remember that we're on Brighteon.com, which is a new non-censoring alternative to the major video platforms. It really needs to be supported. You don't have to give them money, just use them. Because if they get a lot more hours of people watching videos on that site instead of the sites you're used to, that raises their ad revenue and they can stay on operating and hopefully get much, much bigger so that everybody who gets censored off the main ones can go to Brighteon. And that's Brighteon, BRIGHTEON.com/channel/LostArtsRadio. We're over there, and subscriptions will be possible soon. Let me see what else. And we've got the Sunday shows like this one will continue as long as we can. Help us on Subscribe Star if you want that to keep going. And I guess, my motive in spending the time to do all this stuff is I want the information that's being blocked from us now, whether it's health information or economic information or what's going on in the world, especially information about the tremendous potential power that one individual has by changing what I can only call consciousness. It leads to everything else. We want to get that to people who are ready to hear it, and hopefully together work on changing the direction of the world away from suicide, which I think would be a waste of a really great planet, toward what we could make here, which is just the opposite. And you're the primary part of it. You're not some little 1 out of 7 billion people person. You have immense, virtually limitless capabilities. That's what this is about. And the person to wake those up is you. So I hope to give some helpful information in that direction. So anyway, if you want to come to the club, I'll see you at planetaryhealingclub.com. Otherwise, watch for the next Sunday video and free ones we put out during the week as often as we can. And I think that's most of it. Thanks for being with us this time. And glad you got to hear Dr. Pesta. And I'm going to invite him back to talk about his book. In the meantime, have a great week, and we'll see you soon.